racial injustice, massive unemployment, obviously the political theater landscape. We could go on and on and on. The fires now out west. Have some of these themes, influenced things that you're writing now, or maybe influence things that you're trying to finish up?
Well, I mean, they've definitely influenced my life. I think about them all the time. I have some trouble writing about current events. I don't know, you can't always write poems about the things that you want to write about. So, but I have written I wrote a few poems early in the pandemic, just a couple, one of which its shelf life lasted about a month, and I could tell it was sort of out of date already. The other one you can find it on Plume Poetry, the website. So that was back in, it went up in June, but the poems was about March and April. Yeah, my poems, and the poems in the book, of course, were written way before any of this started. Well, I mean, there's been racial injustice forever, but so the book doesn't really deal with that. It's mostly about other things, including my relationship with my father and his death and stuff like that. But yeah, so that's not a very good answer to your question, but
No, I think for most people, it probably hasn't affected them in the current moment. I think probably it's going to reverberate, in the months or years ahead in terms of the writing. So,
right.
I think it's very understandable.
Yeah, it'd be the opposite of emotion recollected in tranquility. It's the opposite of tranquility, most of that stuff. So it's maybe turning Wordsworth on his head a little bit.
So what would be a triggering event be for you to start a poem? Is it a conversation? You're reading something? We always try to understand, how does it start for you? How does a poem start for you?
Okay. Well, they can start with almost anything. That's the thing. And so an image comes to you, or often a connection between two things, maybe a metaphoric connection comes into your head, or something just clicks, or a phrase. But the triggering, it can come later. Like there's a poem in my last book, for instance, where I wanted to write a poem about this thing that happened in the airport where my wife mistook me for a stranger. But I didn't have the way into the poem. I didn't have a start. And so the triggering actually came later than the idea. So that's kind of interesting in itself. I was driving my daughter to the train to go to school, and we were listening to Van Morrison, and there was a line in a Van Morrison song that just got it. The phrase in the song became very much like the first phrase in the poem. So sometimes, yeah, and then that first phrase is so important in a poem. It's sort of the angle of entry into the subject matter, and so you need that to get into the poem. So literally every poem starts with a phrase, right on the page, but the triggering can be that phrase, or it can be maybe some memory, or almost anything.
Okay. So, how do you know when a poem is complete for you?
Well, you don't really know. The reason that Paul Valéry's line about a poem was never finished, always abandoned, is quoted so often is because it's true. You kind of just stop after a while. You can also over-revise. So you think a poem's not done, and you keep revising, and then it becomes a little wooden, and doesn't have its naturalness anymore. So you need to go back to an earlier version, or try to get a hold of that initial impulse to write the poem again. So maybe it's a little bit like when a child is doing a finger painting, and the parent knows when to take it away before it becomes like just a mess, and it's still kind of fresh. So yeah, it's hard to know. Some of my poet friends are on this call, and they can help with that. They can tell you it's not finished, it needs something, or actually you've gone too far with this, so yeah, it's a difficult situation. I mean, you end up changing the poem even when it's in proof sometimes, or definitely in the last stages of the manuscript for a book. You thought the poem was done, but you see again that this phrase could be better, or maybe you cut a whole stanza. I've done that in the last stages once or twice. So
yeah, we heard from someone probably about 5-6 weeks ago that the poem actually talked to them and basically completed themselves. Like, I'm done. It's like your toaster or refrigerator making noises and saying, okay, I'm done for now. So no, it's just interesting. It was like an interesting statement.
Well, there is this certain feeling that you get, but there's also the uncertainty of, am I right? Is that true? So yeah.
Great. So that's it for the hot seat questions. So let's hear some of your, have you read some poems.
Okay, so I'm going to read poems from this new book, and I'm going to try and share my screen just for a second. We'll see how this goes. I hope I don't disappear on you, but I don't know if you can.
Oh, good.
Can you see that? I'll do this too. So that's the cover. And my brother, who I think is on this call, did that painting. And that is the sort of waterway between the two lakes where our family has a place. So it's literally between lakes. So there are some poems about that area in the Adirondacks in the book. And then I was also thinking of the phrase between lakes in a more of a metaphoric sense. So for instance, there are poems about my father and my father's last illness and his death, and that sense of somebody being around even after they're gone. So that hopefully that meaning comes across when people read the book too. Now I need to figure out how to get out of that. Oh, I did it. Okay, so, and if I close that, now I'm not. Okay. Did that work?
Yeah, good.
Okay. All right, cool. So as I said, the book's in 4 sections. The middle 2 sections are about my relationship with my father and my father's final illness and death, and then looking back, memories. The first section is a little bit different. It's a little bit more things as they are, or more direct look at the world without the sort of more emotional complications that come in the second 2 sections. So I'm going to start with those. And I'll start with a poem, a very short poem that is sort of about the lake. And it's called Ektachrome Days. I don't know if you remember the kind of film called Ektachrome, but it sort of emphasized blues. Kodachrome emphasized warm colors like red, but and the lake is so blue sometimes, and the sky. So there are these days that sort of feel like Ektachrome. Ektachrome Days. The way it turned everything blue, even bluer, like the north wind on days like today, deepening the lake to cobalt and bringing fall a little closer. An old slide found in a desk drawer, held up to the light, moving the past into the present, into a day too blue to last. So the next one is, there's some poems in this book about sort of shared experiences. And actually, so this, I'm going to share my screen again. Do this. So this painting by Piero della Francesca, it was visiting Boston from Italy a few years ago, and I was looking at it with a friend. I'm just going to leave that up if that's okay. And I think he's on the call, Eric Karpeles. He's a painter and a writer himself. And so it's called Sharing a Painting. Some people read this poem when it came out in a magazine and were pointing out that a lot of the things that I say about the painting are wrong, and that's on purpose. I mean, it's not really an art historical painting. It's just a painting about two people looking at a painting and saying some different kind of things, some of which are a little crazy. Sharing a painting. For half an hour, we had the painting mostly to ourselves. And the longer we stood there, taking it in together, the more the people drifting around us seemed to disappear. We spoke quietly when we spoke at all, as though trying not to discomfort the mother and child, though they seemed imperturbable, inhabiting a world apart, along with the two angels who stood behind them on either side, vigilant, looking in different directions, like I said, celestial Secret Service agents. The one in the blue robe, head globed as though in a space helmet, fixed us in his gaze and seemed to be guarding a back room that you said looked inviting, illuminated by a slanting beam of tangible sunlight. I couldn't help remarking that the basket of gauze cloth behind the other angel looked like a pie topped with meringue, placed on an upper shelf to cool, beyond the reach of mortals. We marveled at the tenderness of Mary's delicate fingers cradling the feet of the child, who appeared to weigh several pounds less than if he'd been part of our world. He shared his mother's pensive serenity, had the face of an old man he would never live to be, and wore a coral pendant like a branching artery. He held his right hand up as if to call for silence, but we were done with talking. It was just the two of us and the four of them in that unearthly stillness. So let me get rid of this painting now. Okay, so the next poem I'm going to read is also about a shared experience. And I think one of the people that I was with this day is also on this call. So that's nice. We were in Wareham, Massachusetts, and we paddled kayaks into a cove, and the light was doing this amazing thing on the grass, all this marsh grass. And it's almost impossible to describe, but I tried to describe it in this poem. The light in the marsh grass. The light in the marsh grass was alive, small creatures aglow and crawling one after the other down each tall green blade, thousands of them bending at all angles along the quaggy edge of the salt marsh cove the three of us had paddled our kayaks into. Luminous bits of green gold sliding down the myriad stalks, but inside them, as if the marsh were sucking down the warm light through innumerable living straws, drop after drop, in a wavering, steady, mesmerizing rhythm. And for once, no explanation we could think of. That unseen ripples on the cove's mirrory stillness focused the late sunlight in eely ribbons that scrolled down the blades of Spartina, could diminish the marvel we had chanced upon. And we gave up trying to explain it, gave ourselves to it, as if we had ingested some hallucinogen that opened our eyes to what was there all along, but had gone unnoticed. Each of us in our own pod of selfhood, floating on the fetid primordial cove, now held together in odd suspension by these grasses aswarm with lights that also flowed in waves through us, wanting it not to stop, asking ourselves why we'd never seen what had been going on for eons, asking how we could keep it, and knowing we could not. Okay. Okay, so next on my list is another. At a certain point, I'm going to stop showing you things, but it's kind of something you can do on Zoom and not at a regular reading, so I might as well take advantage of it. So this, okay, there we go. So put it on slideshow. Okay, so this is a photograph by Gary Winogrand that I saw at the Metropolitan Museum of Art at least 5 years ago now at a show of his work. And it inspired this next poem, which is a little bit longer. I don't know if I should leave that up, but I mean, people have different opinions about whether a poem about a work of art you should actually show the work or not, but since I can do it now, I'm doing it. So this is called Girl Carrying a Suitcase, and it's about 4 pages long, but the lines are pretty short, so I don't think it'll take that long. Girl carrying a suitcase. Younger in the photo than my daughter is now, 18 or 19, the same age as my wife when I first met her. She would now be not quite old enough to be my mother, more like an older cousin I saw only in summer and would steal glimpses of or find ways to be near. Just as I kept circling back to this girl's photograph at the exhibition to study again the way her body bends slightly to the right to offset the weight of her fabric-covered suitcase against the lighter raffia bag in her other hand. The tapered cut of her sleeveless dress printed with black-eyed Susans, one centered over a breast, and the way her silver bracelets gather at her wrists, below the almost dimples on the inside of her elbows, the photo's shadowed foci. And since bringing home the postcard I bought at the museum shop, I've been searching her image like a figure recovered from my own past. Someone I almost recognize, though her head is veiled in glare and her hair coming loose from her braids conceals the right side of her face. She gazes downward toward the sidewalk she has just stepped onto from the busy crosswalk, unhurried and alone amid the crowd of the city she is either leaving or returning to, but not arriving in for the first time. She is too unguarded, lost in herself, thinking perhaps of whoever she has just been staying with or is about to visit, someone who, whether cousin, friend, parent, or lover, must surely adore her. If only I could find her and show her this photograph, which almost certainly she has never seen since it was printed for the first time only recently, decades after the photographer's death. Or at least send her this postcard I've been keeping on my desk these last few weeks, giving this stolen glimpse of her past back to her, so she too might be taken by this young woman who was once herself, like someone held dear who left long ago, then one late afternoon shows up at the door. Okay. There we go. Okay, so, okay, I'm gonna move to the middle of the book now. John, I didn't really look at my watch, so you can sort of signal me when I've been going on too long. So this section has some poems about my relationship with my father when I was growing up. So I'm going to read one called Higher Education. Antioch, Berkeley, and Columbia were the ABCs of colleges my father said he wouldn't pay for. Breeding grounds for radicalism, he called them, as if their campuses were giant petri dishes spawning toxic cultures. Our own pathology was pretty toxic at the time, both of us stubbornly refusing to learn anything about each other, or about ourselves for that matter, stuck in a rudimentary pattern of defining ourselves as opposites. I wouldn't even look at Kenyon, his beloved alma mater, despite its long tradition as a school for future poets. I hadn't read a word of Robert Lowell or James Wright yet, but I'd read Ginsberg, and the first stop on my college tour was Columbia, and that's where I ended up going. And my father, to his credit, must have seen it was the right place for me, or at least was unavoidable. So he let me go, and he paid for it. And the only price I had to pay was when I was home on holidays to suffer his barbed commentary about the very education he was financing, which ironically had to do with the core values of Western civilization. I can't remember, is forgiveness one of them? We both got a C in forgiveness, but later bumped it up to a B- when, in a surprising twist, my son ended up at Kenyon. My father took real pleasure in that, though he was already dying by then. I thought of him at graduation, how proud he would have been for his grandson, who, he might have joked, was a better student than he had ever been. All our ignorance put aside, at least, for that one day of celebration. So I think I'll actually skip to the next section, which is a little grimmer in places because it's partly about my father's death. This is a little poem set in the ICU in the hospital. It's called Last Advice. The night before my father died, I dreamed he was back home, and I in my old room on the 3rd floor. And he was calling up to me from the bottom of the stairs, some advice I couldn't hear or recall the next day when, standing over him back in the ICU, full of the chirping of machines we had decided to unplug, I remembered the dream and heard him call my name. Okay, so I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. What do you think?
It's almost 1:30, so, another 10 minutes.
Okay,
wanna
I'll
take
just read
15 minutes?
I'll just read a few more.
You've got a lot of people on the call here today, so they may want to do a bunch of Q&A.
Okay, all right, so I'll do a few more. That's so this one is called My Father's Sweater. It's about, well, you'll see, it's pretty self-explanatory. My father's sweater. I'd almost forgotten about the Norwegian sweater I borrowed from my father when I was in college and wore so often that its intricate design of grayish, creamy checks inside a navy grid flecked with a lighter blue became so much a part of me that even he began reluctantly to think of it as mine. Later, I sewed patches made from socks inside the fraying neck. I never gave it back, but over several decades, as the patches came loose, one of the elbows gave out and a cuff unraveled, began to wear it less. What a shock to find that sweater in an old footlocker at the bottom of his closet the week after my father died, its pattern as familiar as it was unexpected. When had he stolen it back? And why, since now it looked too threadbare to be worn? It felt like a game he had won posthumously. And I didn't mind that the joke was on me, only that the game was over. Now it would always be my father's sweater. What could I do but, trying not to rip it further, take it from the trunk, slip my arms through the sleeves, and pull it over my head? Okay, this is pretty short. I have a previous book that has a lot to do with my brother's death. This one has a lot to do with my father's death. So, but they both kind of come up in this poem. It's called Double Visitation. There I was with my father again alive, walking around the backyard together. And I hardly noticed that it wasn't our backyard, or that he looked like he was in his 50s. We were laughing at something, joking around, each comment making us laugh even harder. But then he was crying, and I didn't know why, his face contorted, unable to speak. I turned and hugged him and whispered in his ear the words I wanted to say and he wanted to hear. And as if I had uttered some magic formula, I found myself sitting in a movie theater beside my suddenly alive again brother. The movie ended, and as the credits rolled, we both agreed that it was good. Then I said, but I think I fell asleep for part of it, and started telling him about the dream I'd had, how our father had visited from the dead, and what I'd done, and to show him, did again, whispering those same words to my brother. And maybe I'll end with the last poem in the book, which is called All Down the Lake. So, I mean, the book itself is literally between lakes too, since the first poem has to do with the lake and the last poem has to do with the lake, but those aren't the only poems about that lake though. Okay, so here it is, All Down the Lake. It wasn't so much that the dinner conversation had bored me as that I was simply tired of words, particularly my own. So afterwards, I slipped away and followed the path down to the boathouse, where I sat in a lawn chair. The lake was perfectly still, the inky hills on the far shore mirrored between two skies of deepening blue and streaked with clouds tinged with the last pink. At first, I didn't notice the strange sounds, then didn't recognize them as human, the faint, distorted, jumbled voices of dinner conversations all down the lake's mile length, sliding across the glossy surface only to rebound off the shore and swirl together in a confusion of murmurous babble. Now and then a weird inflection or wild laugh broke free from the hubbub and twisted up like a bottle rocket left over from the Fourth. It was a relief and really a pleasure not to make out the words or even the coherent intonations of sense-making and just focus on the hallucinatory far-off din. Then slowly, as the dinner parties one by one dispersed, the voices dropped away until only a few remained, less alien sounding now. Then none. The lake itself a mind that had finally quieted its chatter, just as the first stars glimmered into being and a bullfrog started calling deep and steady. Thank you for listening.
Oh, very nice, very nice. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great.
I don't know who said that, but thank you.
Someone in the chat, S. Moody, said, I loved this poem about your father, Jeff.
That's me.
Oh, great.
I love the images in general. I really enjoy your images, Jeff. It's like I can see photos and pictures when you read your poetry. It's incredible. I'm a friend of Dina.
Oh, great. All right. Well, thanks for coming. And that means a lot to me. I am sort of a visual person. So, yeah.
And it's interesting that your brother is an artist, a painter.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
Wonderful, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any questions? My poems don't really generate a lot of questions because they're easy to understand.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that you read My Father's Sweater and Double
Yes.
Visitation. I think those are wonderful poems.
Oh, thanks, George. That's great.
Yeah, it was strong.
And there's more praise for Double Visitation in the chat box.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, good. Well, that's that's one of the poems that means the most to me. So I'm glad when people like it.
Jeff, it's Sarah. Just a wonderful reading. And I have to tell you, I loved it that you showed those images with the paintings.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was a wonderful way to hear them. And they take on different resonance when you're reading them without the image, but it was lovely to see those. So I think that's a great idea. And a huge congratulations. Yay.
Oh, thanks. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Jeff, you were asked at the outset what triggers a poem for you. I wonder whether when you're assembling a manuscript, you look at the manuscript and you think, there's a missing link here, there's a gap, and I need to fill it, and then choose to write a poem that you think fills the gap. Does that ever happen to you?
I'm trying to remember if I've ever done that. I know people do that, and sometimes it turns out to be the best poem in the book. My problem is sometimes that I wait so long before I look to see if I have enough poems to make a manuscript. Like, I don't do it as I go along. I don't really want to be thinking about that. So in the end, I end up having too many, and it's more like, how do I fit them together? And it's more like certain poems fall away, maybe because they're not as good, but also maybe because they just don't fit. You know, you kind of figure out the themes, and it's a puzzle too, the whole assembly of a book manuscript. It's kind of like playing gin rummy, and you don't know whether you're going for runs or like 3 or 4 of a kind. And there's all these different ways to link the poems to each other and make groups of poems. But eventually you figure something out that works. I mean, nothing's going to be perfect, and you don't really want it to be perfect. You want some play in there, but yeah, I don't know if I've done that. I'll probably end this call and think, oh yeah, I did do that, and I should have mentioned. Yeah. But I don't know if I've written a poem as a way to, fill a gap for a book.
I think, Jeff, that could probably happen more in a manuscript where you are working with a specific chronology.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeff, there's a question in the chat room saying, what role does your editor play in book assembly, if any?
What was the word? My what?
Editor.
Oh, editor. Well, I mean, editors, my editors have done, they've made a lot of suggestions at a very late stage. So, but they're often very good suggestions. So they're usually on a kind of a small scale. Although there's a very long poem in this book that they thought was too long, and I ended up thinking they were right, and I compressed some parts of it. So, but yeah, and my editors are nice, so they let me say no, so if I don't like the suggestion. So, but yeah, they definitely play a role. Yeah.
Lewis is asking, can you please say more about your statement that you don't want a poem to be perfect?
Did I say that? Oh, well, a poem can't be perfect. So there's really not anything you can do about that. So, but I mean, you do want, and you definitely don't want it to be perfect as you go along writing it, because you want to invite things to happen, things that you didn't know were going to happen in the writing of the poem. I don't know. I'm not sure a poem can be perfect. I mean, there are very exquisite, diamond-like poems in the world, and some of those are great, but I think mine are a little bit messier. I mean, I'm not all over the page kind of, so there's some order, but yeah, I'm not really answering that question very, very well, but yeah, I don't know. Well, you just want the poem to evoke things sometimes, and the reader will find things that you didn't even think of. But I don't know. Perfection is not one of my real topics, I guess.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments?
We can't end on that one.
Jeff, can I make a request for tomorrow night?
Sure.
Would you read the poem about Elizabeth Bishop tomorrow night? That's a wonderful poem.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's also about the Grateful Dead. It's not just about Elizabeth Bishop. So,
I just want to say hi, Jeff.
hey,
And
Tom,
thank
how you
you.
doing?
Good.
Thanks for coming.
It was a pleasure.
Of course, at the mention of it, I think we all now want to hear the Elizabeth Bishop Grateful Dead poem.
Drew called him out. Good job, Drew.
You're welcome. I like to put fire under him.
Yeah, well, I don't know if we have time. I could read it.
No, we have time. It's 1:40. We've got 20 minutes.
Okay. So I wanted to write a poem about Elizabeth Bishop and the Grateful Dead for a really long time. And it was going to be about the 1991 MLA conference where the Elizabeth Bishop Society was started in a hotel room, and I was there. And at the same time, you know, there are all these lectures going on at the MLA and job interviews too. But every night I was going, it's always between Christmas and New Year's. And so it was in San Francisco that year. And I was going to see the Grateful Dead every night with my friend Bruce, who I think is also on this call. So I think I was probably the only person at the MLA that was going to the Dead every night, and also probably the only person at the Dead, you know, that was at the MLA. So, but that's not what the poem is about. I tried to write that poem over and over and never went anywhere. But then I got this, I can't remember the inspiration. Oh, I heard that Bishop had given, well, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to give that away. I will say that after the poem. So Bishop lived in San Francisco from 1968 to 1969, which was a pretty fertile time for the Grateful Dead. So, so here's the poem. It's a little bit lighter than some of the others. Elizabeth Bishop and the Grateful Dead. Whether she ever saw them perform, we don't know, but she did go to a Janis Joplin show, and Tom Gunn's account of smoking a joint with her backstage at a group reading makes it easier to imagine her chatting with Jerry during a break about Billie Holiday or Baudelaire or Blake, if not dancing in the aisles during one of the band's already notoriously labyrinthine jams, like the one between Dark Star and St. Stephen, a new song in their repertoire that season. He would have been 26, she 57. She might have let it drop that Donovan wanted to record The Burglar of Babylon. He might have praised her trippy Riverman, but she probably wouldn't have uttered the phrase she'd used in one of her unfinished essays to describe the music of a rock band she'd seen several times that year, a fucking machine. Though that might have led to a flurry of wit or perhaps a killer rendition of Love Light with Pigpen lewdly rapping in the second set. Unlikely, still, I'd like to think it happened. My favorite poet meeting my favorite band. Her partner then was in her 20s and had connections to the music scene. Also, in the year and a half she lived in San Francisco, the Dead gave over 65 performances. So you'd think she'd have seen them once. Is that too much of a stretch? Well, this just in. 5 or so years later, on one of her trips up to her beloved Nova Scotia, Bishop brought as a present for her teenage cousin a copy of Europe 72, a triple album gathered from live concerts, telling him the Grateful Dead was a band to know about, and also that it was okay to smoke pot. So I had read online that Bishop had given a Grateful Dead album to her young cousin, and I went to some lengths to try to figure out which album. So I did find that. I did actually email eventually with that cousin. So that was fun. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. It's great.
Yeah. Thanks, George.
Hey, before we sign off, and I don't know if Wendy was going to say it or I was going to say it, you know, we are looking for new poets to begin our season in December. We're booked through November 18th. So the other poets that are on the call, if you're interested, you could contact Wendy Pearson at the library.
There's some good poets on this call, so hopefully some of them will.
Yeah.
Great. We look forward to hearing from them. And speaking of great poets, Jeffrey, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. Your
Thanks
work,
for having me. It was fun.
it was really nice for us as well.
Thanks everybody for coming.
No, it's great.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Jeffrey.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Jeff.